Welcome to my channel. I'm Dr. Rachel Tapman, and my channel is for anybody who cares about language technology and other people. And today we've got a little bit of a special treat for y'all. And this is, spoiler alert, part of something I've been working on for a while and finally finished. My God, it was so much work. And that is a little book I published on my coffee on the 9 most common language technology mistakes I've seen in my career, especially people who are newer to the field make. Wow, that was a very complex sentence. Anyway, and today we're going to talk about the most common one and how you can avoid it. And if I had a nickel for every time I'd seen somebody do this, or like they ran into problems that were a direct result of this, I'd have a lot of nickels. I could, probably buy a milkshake or something. All right, so let's hop right on in. So first of all, I'm gonna say that this is a mistake. Happens all the time, but particularly if you're using at least some machine learning techniques. If you're using a completely rule-based system, this can still be a problem, but it won't be a problem to the same degree necessarily. And the error is, I'm not going to keep you waiting that long, it's domain mismatch. And this is sort of what I call it. There's a lot of different names for it. And domain here, I will say, is in the linguistic sense and not the networking sense, right? So this isn't like a web domain. Basically what this means is you have the wrong training data. You should have had different training data and you don't. And it is, Brett says, milkshakes. Milkshake sounds good right now. And this is a huge, huge issue. And part of the reason that it's an issue, no, my slides, align, there we go. Part of the reason that it's an issue is that a lot of folks who are new to working with language data don't necessarily consider what makes something mismatched. It's a lot of factors. And I'm only going to talk about the ones that I've seen most recently or most commonly here. There's a lot of other ones to consider. I mean, the most obvious one is it in the same language you're going to be seeing, right? If I build an English language model and I deploy it in an exclusively French-speaking community, it's not going to work very well, right? So I'm not talking about stuff like that. I'm going to talk about some specific things. Yeah, they're sliding slides. And those are topic, modality, formality, and intended audience. Again, there's a lot of other stuff as well, but this is a good start and things to keep in mind, regardless of what else you consider as well. So topic, I think this is what most people are most familiar about, particularly when it comes to text data. So, topic modeling is a task. I think this is a way that most language technologists, even very new ones, are used to thinking about grouping types of texts. So what is it about? And there are some specific things that if you don't have a match in topic between your training data and your target data that you're seeing in prediction are going to be particularly difficult. One is tokens, right? So these could be words, these could be morphemes, these could be characters, but are you seeing the tokens that you are seeing in production in your training data? Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of out of vocabulary issues, and basically it's just not going to work very well, right? And again, if we think about this extreme example of, I have an English model and I'm trying to use it on French data, well, the words are going to be different, right? And when you do see words that you think might be the same, they're not necessarily actually going to have the same meaning. So like fruits, right? The English word fruits in French, I think it means something like seafood usually, like it's at least that's what I've been taught. I would not call myself a fluent French speaker by any stretch of the imagination. So you have something that looks the same but means something different. And if you are working within the same language, often these are discussed as senses. So word sense disambiguation is the general task of being like, okay, if somebody says bank, do they mean like a financial bank? Do they mean a river bank? Do they mean like a gene bank, or sort of like a metaphorical sense of bank that doesn't have anything to do with finance specifically? It's just a place to put something. Banking can be a verb. It can mean to sort of like, in a vehicle to sort of go to one side. It could mean to do the action of putting things in a bank. So there's lots of ways that you could interpret this particular set of 4 letters. And if you don't have relevant examples in your training data, your system's not going to pick up on those differences. Another example here is art, right? So this is a term that's used really often in NLP papers when talking about state of the art, and it has nothing to do with paintbrushes, and it has nothing to do with sculpting. It is, you know, specifically art here means sort of the practice of the field doing things. So it's a sense of the word that you're going to see a lot. And if you're working with a model that hasn't been trained on NLP text and you're trying to look at NLP text, you're going to get some probably weird artifacts because of that. And then of course there's phrases. So I didn't come up with examples here, which is my fatal flaw as instructors, as I don't always come up with all the exact phrases that I need. But like state of the art, right? That's a phrase. It's used in that way. It has a specific meaning. It can be initialized to soda, and you still know what it means, SOTA, or now you do if you didn't already. And there's also a lot of differences in what sort of syntactic formations you can use, you know, in different texts. So if you've ever heard somebody say like something obtains in a mathematical sense, that is different from I want to obtain something in a more general conversational text. One of them is transitive and one of them is not, for just as an example of something where there's a syntactic difference between these two types of words. And sure, if there's like one token in your token set that's out of vocabulary, that's fine. If there's like one sense you haven't seen, you'll probably be okay. But if a lot of your data is a mismatch and a lot of what you're seeing you don't have examples of in training, you're gonna have a bad time. And you know, your model may be working perfectly, your training algorithm may be working perfectly, but you just don't have the signal you need to do the task you want to do. All right, modality. This is one that is starting to trip up people more and more as, in particular, text transcription becomes more common and cheaper. So modality basically means, how is this language produced? Was it spoken aloud, like I'm speaking to you? Was it written? If it was written, was it typed or handwritten? There's, you know, you're going to see differences in the type of language that you'll see in those situations. Or is it a signed language? And we'll talk a little bit about signed languages a little bit later on. But a lot of times you'll hear me say things like, you know, language users, to broadly mean everyone who is producing language regardless of the modality. So some general patterns of the differences between spoken language, even if it's been transcribed, right? The original language production was done in this speaking setting, as opposed to typed or written, as opposed to sign. So spoken language generally tends to be more informal. We'll talk about formality in more depth. You tend to have fewer rare words in spoken language. People tend to have a bias towards more common words. Most words, in fact, are more common. So you have, if you're familiar with the Zipfian distribution, it's okay if you aren't, we'll probably talk about it at some other point in the channel, but it's going to be far more skewed towards the, you know, the center. I don't want to commit to saying it's the right or left right now because I know one of them's going to be wrong and I'm probably going to say it. It'll be more skewed towards the center of the distribution, more skewed towards the first rank. You're also going to see way more pronouns in spoken text than you will in written text. And you know what? I don't know off the top of my head if that pertains to written dialogue as well. So something like scripted spoken text, which is designed to sound natural but is not. Yeah, TBD, I should look that up. And then things like disfluencies and fillers. So a lot of people who are working with transcribed text for the first time will just automatically remove all the all of those sorts of words. Things like so, which is one that I use a lot. Things like, you know, like, things that are done to hold the floor in the case of a conversation, things that are done to indicate, you know, certainty. In English, we don't have evidentiality markers, but fillers can kind of play that role of evidentiality markers. Disfluency, straight up speaking errors, which are going to be very different from writing errors. And those contain information. So spoken language is not the same as typed or written language use. Speaking of written language, you're going to get way more rare words. So you're going to find, in general, more jargon in written language than in spoken language. You're also going to find complete sentences. So this is a sort of interesting phenomena where a lot of people assume that when they speak in complete sentences all the time. And I am in a, monologuing sort of situation right now. And I've also, I would say I'm pretty fluent at this type of language use. But I would guess that, somewhere around a third of the sentences that I am producing are not, traditional complete sentences that would look great if I just wrote them down. And if you haven't transcribed a lot of text, spoken language, and you haven't, spent a lot of time working with that type of data, I think it's very common to assume you're going to see, beautiful parsable sentences everywhere in all language use, and that's not necessarily the case. If any syntacticians want to start beef, I'm happy to do that on Twitter. We'll take it there. You're also going to see a wider variety of characters. So people don't say emojis, right? So particularly things like emojis seem to be taking on some of the role that we would use gestures for in a spoken interaction. So things like facial expressions, things like hand gestures, that information is being encoded using different characters. Also, you're going to see scripts. You only need a script if a language is written. If it's spoken, you don't, right? The spoken language is the thing in and of itself. Also, spelling errors. You're not going to see spelling errors in spoken language because people don't spell things. You will see spelling errors, however, occasionally in signed languages. So signed languages, I'm saying languages here because it's a common misconception that there is one single sign language, or that sign languages are sort of manual versions of spoken languages. That's not the case. They're full languages in and of themselves, even though there are some systems for manually representing I'm thinking of English here, for example. So signed exact English is a gesture system to represent spoken or written English. It is not a signed language in and of itself. Another common misconception about signed languages is that you only need to look at the hands and things, like hand shape, the direction of the palm, the movement, all those sorts of things, when in a sign language context, the entire body will include grammatical information. So non-manuals is sort of the general term for everything that's going on outside of the hands. You're also going to see things like spatial referencing, right? So whereas in spoken language, we might use pronouns to refer back to things that have been, discussed earlier in the conversation, right? So we would use sort of anaphor. In a sign language setting, often things will be placed at specific places in space, right? So like, oh, I'm talking about Betty, I'm going to put Betty there. And every time I refer to that place, know that I am referring to Betty, this person. So instead of having an anaphor system and pronouns, you have spatial referencing, which is, placing things in space. And also finger spelling. So this is not a universal, but for sign languages that come to be in a larger hearing community where most of that hearing community is literate, finger spelling is a way to represent borrowed words, which is why I'm saying that you can't have misspellings in signed language. I'd also say, if you are like, sign languages are so cool, I want to work on them. Yeah, they're fabulous. They're a wonderful cultural heritage of the deaf community. But if you are not deaf and no one you are working with is deaf, maybe take a big step back and collaborate with deaf stakeholders. So the capital D deaf there is for representing culturally deaf. So someone who, may or may not have the disability, but is from deaf culture, particularly in the United States. I'm not sure how common this particular way of discussing it is globally, but yes, don't assume that you know what disabled folks are going to want, and if you are not within the community, maybe don't make decisions for them, is my general pitch to you there. All right. And after modality, so we had topic, we had modality. Now, formality. And this is something that generally in sort of like academic sociolinguistic literature got a lot of research done on it a couple decades ago. I would say that currently it doesn't seem to be as central to the sociolinguistic literature in particular. However, in NLP, there's a lot of interest in this because, as it turns out, when people are on social media, they're generally pretty informal. And that is an important arena where NLP happens, right? There's an important place where people are producing language. When people are texting, they generally tend to be informal. When people are writing forum posts, they generally tend to be pretty informal. So the sort of general term for this in NLP is noisy user-generated text. There's a workshop on it. I have a chapter in a book that is not nearby, so I can't tell you the title, which is sort of like focused on this particular group of users as well. And the thing about informal text is that it has a lot more variation than more formal text. What makes text formal is that it has sort of learned, right? Generally, you have to learn how to write formally. There's a reason why if you've ever been in a position to grade college papers, you can generally tell where someone is in their college career by the way they produce written text, because if they're very experienced, they'll be like, this is following the forms that I expect, and if they're very inexperienced, it generally won't. And that sort of, institutional samening tends to create not super varied text, right? So particularly if you're looking at professional publishing outlets like news sources, they have very strict style and editing guides to make everyone sound sort of the same. You don't have that. You have certainly social norms within groups, but the text that you will see, the language that you will see in an informal setting is wildly varying. And if you don't expect that, right, and if you train your models using the Wall Street Journal, very popular corpus in NLP, and then you give it Twitter posts, you're probably going to have a bad time. Also, slang versus jargon. So these are both tokens that are probably going to be a little bit rare in your training data. And in slang, it's because, so these are generally informal terms that are used often as part of youth culture. And these come in and out of usage very, very quickly. So like when I was in college, epic was a very popular slang term. Everything was epic. That's not really the case anymore, right? It sounds very dated for me to say, epic blog post. Jargon tends to be a lot more stable, and these are terms of art, right? In the state-of-the-art sense. These are terms that professional groups use with others in their professional group. And yeah, so if you are building technology to be put into production to interact with user data, it's almost certainly going to be informal. There are settings where that may not be the case. So things like medical note transcriptions or legal text or specific domains that are a little bit more formal, but a lot of them won't be. And the difficulty here is that a lot of NLP tools assume that you're going to get formal text because they were trained on formal text because that's what was easy to get. And also that was, most of what people wrote down and shared in a computer readable format, right? So yes, know about that. This gets people often and is a big source of difficulty in training models. And then the third factor to think about, or I guess fourth factor, is intended audience. So all human language is produced by a human for a specific audience. Now that we're sort of in the age of neural language generation as a consumer good, a little bit less the case, but anyway, if it is language by a human, which is probably what you're interested in working with, it was produced for someone, even if that someone was only the person who wrote it, right? So even if someone is journaling, there is still an intended audience for that text, and it is them. And who the intended audience is going to dramatically change the language produced. And if you have sort of a mismatch between intended audience and, let's say, annotators, you're going to run into issues. So a big one is human versus computer directed speech, right? So when a person used this language, did they think they were talking to a human or did they think they were talking to a computer? And in particular in speech settings, you tend to get, so One thing that people will do when they know that someone has difficulty understanding their speech for various reasons is that they will modify their speech. So for children, for example, there's a set of varieties within each language called child-directed speech. So in English, it might be something like, "Oh, look at you, aren't you cute?" It has very, exaggerated intonation. It is not like the type of speech that I am producing right now. And when people are talking to computers, sometimes they assume that computers also have differences in understanding ability, and they may start to produce, hyper-articulated speech. It may be slower, it may be louder, there may be sort of like bigger plosives. There's lots of things that might be different sort of in the speech signal, and also when people are writing, things that might be different in their written text. So if you are training on human-directed speech and you're getting computer-directed speech, or if you're training on computer-directed text and you are getting human-directed text, you're probably going to have some pretty systematic differences that might make your life difficult. Also, assumed knowledge, right? If any of you have, a close group of friends or family, I hope that's all of you. I hope you have one of those things at least. And you, excuse me, get a quick drink of water. And when you're, how's better? Okay. And when you're with that group, if you have a conversation, sometimes it may be completely not understandable to someone from outside that group, right? So you're going to have terms that will reference events that you know about that a third party might not. You'll have sort of like, I don't know, if any of you have siblings, they'll be like 2-word phrases that are a whole joke, right? And if I'm talking to a group of close friends, I will assume they have that knowledge, and the language that I produce will be lower context. Whereas when I'm talking to you, I don't assume that you share that knowledge and background with me, even though I may know some of you in real life. So that's a big difference. In general, speech or text that is being broadcast, so things like blogs are going to be assume less context than things like forum posts or things that are to a specific audience where that audience is known. What languages are they using? So, I am doing this in English, because English is the language that I know best by a long shot. And also, a lot of NLP educational content is in English, so I'm assuming that this is a fairly useful language for you all. But you can't assume, with complete certainty that you're going to get a specific language when people are interacting with your system. And assuming for sure that you're going to get that is... I've seen some very frustrated engineers who made this assumption and it did not pan out. And then of course, formality, which we talked about. What formality the text has is going to be a quality not only of where I'm producing it, but also who I'm producing it for. So 4 things to keep in mind. Is it on the same topic? Was it produced in the same way? Is it a matching formality, right? And then is the intended audience, do I know what the intended audience of the language that my users are going to be producing is? And does it match the intended audience of the language that I have in my training set? And if I have annotators, are they part of that intended audience? Do they understand the context? Will they be able to make accurate annotations? So those are the issues. Now let's talk about some ways to avoid it. And I do see there's stuff in the chat, and I will, I'll get to that in a sec, but I want to make sure that this is sort of like questions at the end and like condensed content in the middle. So how do you avoid this, right? It's very frustrating if you have, irrelevant training data. Maybe you can tune with more relevant training data, but it depends on how much you have. It depends on how big the difference was. You're going to have a much better time if you just have the right training data to begin with. How do you know if your training data is the right training data? So the first thing is have a good idea of how people are going to interact with your project, whether that's UX interviews, whether that's you're working with your designers, you're doing, I don't know, alpha testing with user groups or something. No, make sure that your assumptions about how people are going to use the project are correct, because it's very easy to make wrong assumptions. Second, once you know what those interactions are going to look like, get training data that's like that. And like I said, you might be able to fine tune with relevant training data and start with a larger model that's trained on more general training data. But it's very dangerous to assume that a very large general model is going to have training data that is relevant and no training data that is irrelevant and antagonistic to the task that you're trying to do. So get the relevant stuff for what you're working on. And third, double check. Is the data that you got actually a match for what people are doing? Are people doing what they said they would in the focus groups? Because sometimes they don't. I mean, sometimes you get, unintended users. So one of my favorite examples of this is the Barnes and Noble sort of like app that you could use on their special like reader tablet. Apparently, so you could leave like reviews on books, and apparently that those book reviews were being used as like youngsters as a Warrior Cats role-playing forum. So not an intended use of the product by any stretch of the imagination, but yet a way that people were using it, right? Or particularly during distance learning, a lot of, school students, I don't need to say school, were using things like Google Sheets as a messaging service so they could like chat with each other during school and, socialize and figure out what was going on with each other. So, were you right? And even if you were right for most of the people, do you have like a contingent of users that's just doing stuff you didn't intend? And how can you deal with that and either make sure that you are meeting their needs or, that they're not harming the platform as a whole? All right. I wrote a book. Also, I have some font issues, which are actually one of the, I have some font issues, which are one of the things that I talk about in the book. So, and look at that, I was right. It is available on my my Ko-fi, which is in, gosh darn, that corner. But I also have, I've got a coupon code for you. So if you would like to purchase a copy of the book, it is $5 US, and the coupon code makes it 4. And if you can't afford it, reach out to me and we'll figure it out. All right, now I'm going to look at the chat and I'm just going to leave this up in case any of y'all want the book. It was, I consistently underestimate how much it drains me to write and read, and I'm approaching middle age. You'd think I would know about that and myself by now, but I sure didn't. And it took me about 3 times as long to do this as I originally thought that it would, but I'm very proud of it. I think it looks good, and I think it should have a lot of very helpful information for y'all. Also, I didn't have a lot of citations in here. There's a lot more citations in the PDF, and they're all linked, so you can go and read other stuff. To the chat. Hello, everybody. Hydra, yes. Yeah, spatial referencing is fascinating. I mean, sign languages are really cool and interesting, and they were one of my research areas in graduate school. And I was very fortunate to be able to learn American Sign Language from some, fluent deaf instructors. So Christy Winters and Lance. Oh my gosh, what's Lance's last name? Mostly, I had class with Christy Winters, who also has a master's in linguistics and has published some linguistics research on sign languages as well. So very, very fortunate to have been able to learn from them. All right. Yeah. So Brett says, I had a case of that for Jargon. Oh, Jargon was the app. The text was talking about the Reserve Bank of New Zealand, and it kept rewriting it to the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. Yeah, definitely. So I think you probably had a lot more discussions of one of those than the other than in your training data, and it's sort of like, hold it towards it. Yeah. Hello. Texas Street struggles with live and live. Oh yeah, that makes sense. AM says written versus typed. Okay, yeah, good. So it looks like I answered some of these questions. I also suppose typed text would be less formal than handwritten text. I don't necessarily know that is the case, but maybe. Thank you, Docking. I hope you enjoy it. Yeah. And New Zealand doesn't use American Sign Language. Yes, New Zealand has its own sign language. I definitely know that Australia has Auslan, AUSLAN, which is their sign language, which I believe borrows heavily from BSL, British Sign Language. One of the wild things about British Sign Language is that, so in American Sign Language, you know, fingerspelling, you can't see any of that, sorry. Fingerspelling is done with the single hand. In British Sign Language, it's done with two hands. So like, I think these are the vowels, which is just a very interesting difference. Yeah. Alexi, do you think it's worth learning sign language for hearing people? Yes, if you're learning it from a deaf person. And that is capital D deaf. It's a beautiful language, you know, particularly if you're learning it for the community that lives where you live. You're likely to run into folks and you'll be able to have a nice conversation. So yeah, I would do it. And also, Brett says ASL is taught in many non-English speaking countries. Yes, so a lot of African sign languages or sign languages of Africa do draw very heavily on ASL, and it's because of missionaries and, you know, neo-colonialism. So if you're wondering why there's a lot of ASL in Africa, that's why. Yep. Alexi says, American news anchors tend to have a no accent speech. It looks quite creepy when you don't know where the person is from. So I would say that news speech in particular is a specific domain of speech, right? So it has particular qualities that it has, in particular a very specific intonation. It does have features of, it will often have features of the particular you know, the accent or home accent of the anchor. So even though, yes, there is sort of like a general pattern, if you listen to, you know, news anchors from the South, they'll sound slightly more Southern. If you listen to news anchors from the North, they'll sound slightly more Northern, Western, etc. So yes. Yeah, totally makes sense when writing search queries. Yes, search queries. You would never go up to somebody and be like, you know, what's something somebody might search? NLP resources for freshers. What's that? They wouldn't know what you were talking about. That is a specific domain or like a specific type of computer-directed language. Yes. What is the intended audience for your videos? People who care about language technology and other people. Mostly language technologists. So if you're aspiring or you've been in the field, and in particular, I think this should be especially helpful for people who have a background in software engineering and have been working in computers technology for a while, but are newer to language technology. That has been my experience, is that a lot of people coming into NLP had that software engineering background, but haven't worked with language data much previously. So yeah. Brett says, rap music lyrics are not good training for a call center system. No, completely different domains, right? If I call a call center and they start doing lots of like wordplay and like, you know, complex metrical structures in poetry, I would be a little surprised to hear that, right? Very different. Yeah. Oh, interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that Japanese Sign Language was related to American Sign Language either. Yeah. Word clouds for conversation sound very artistic. Yeah, there was. It's interesting. I feel like I haven't seen as much anymore, but there was a while where like anyone working with language data, you know, if they had like a slideshow about their language data, you bet you'd see a word cloud. Yeah, visualizing language data is, I would say, particularly hard/difficult. I don't know why I said it as if those things were not homonyms, or not. They're not homonyms, synonyms. Yeah, I would say it's an unsolved problem. There's a lot that we just don't know about how to do it good, and it's not because people don't work on it. Yeah, Alexei says, the thing I heard is that nationwide news agencies learn to speak without accent. Is this true? No. So, okay, so I'm sure that if you asked them, that is what they would say. As a linguist, that is not the case. So they are learning a specific register a specific type of speaking, just like an auctioneer is using a specific type of speech that sounds like an auctioneer. They are learning a specific type of speech usage that sounds like a news anchor, if that makes sense, right? So like I would say that I'm not particularly good at sounding like a YouTuber, right? I don't come in and I'm like, what's up? Wow. Haha. I can't keep that up. And B, I find it very difficult to like get information from people when they're talking like that. Clearly I'm, in the minority of folks about that. But all speech is produced with an accent. So nobody is accentless, even though oftentimes you will hear people from the dominant group or dominant social group, whoever has power will say that they don't have an accent and everyone else does. That's not the case. Everyone has an accent. Everyone sounds like they're from somewhere. So, right, I would say even in sort of this very formal situation where I'm not using a lot of, back up there, little dialect shift there for you. That was definitely closer to my home accent than what I'm saying now, which is in much more of a, I would say, educated, mobile person in the US, but definitely from the South. I still have, the vowel space of a Southerner. And there is sort of an interesting sociolinguistic difference between what people perceive as being accented in the United States and what people perceive as being accented in Britain. So in Britain, phonological features are considered much more salient. So the specific sounds of speech tend to get a lot more attention when you are discussing what sounds accented for the varieties of British English. There's a lot of them. In the US, you tend to have specific words and phrases are much more stigmatized, whereas the sounds of speech people tend to pick up on a little bit less. And that just could be because we're, it's a bigger country, people are further apart. There are specific features that people do tend to pick up on and stereotype. So things like warder, which I believe it's a Pennsylvania sort of thing, very stigmatized, not necessarily stigmatized, but people will very much like pick up on it. Things like the palm vowel in New York City. So people will be like, coffee, cup of coffee. And that's a very stigmatized feature, right? That's a phonological feature that people tend to pick up on. But in general, Americans don't tend to pick up on all phonological features. And if you, told somebody that they had an accent and here are the specific phonological features that made you cognizant of where they were from, they tend not to like that. So just from experience, some of them do, but yeah. Lexi says, how do you incorporate all these differences into language models? Well, you don't need all of them, right? You only need the ones that are relevant to your specific area. The large R's. Oh, the sort of the American R sound. So American English is what in linguistics we call rhotic, which means that we say them, whereas things like British English are mostly arhotic, which means that you don't say them. Rhotic is fascinating because it's basically all of the sounds, language sounds, that are represented with characters that are derived from rho. So R, so flaps like, so ara, that middle R sound, flaps like ara, that middle sound. In many English-speaking countries, you will not use flaps. You would instead said ata, so like butter instead of butter. You could also hear that last R sound I just sort of turned into a vowel. I removed its rhoticity. Whether or not R's are vowels is not an argument I want to get into. Some people would say yes. I'm saying no for the purposes of this video. Trills also considered rhotic, so ara. I think there's probably a rhotic lateral, but I don't know it off the top of my head, and I don't know that I could say it good. Yeah. Yeah, and I can't do the, I've never tried to do the news anchor voice, but I guess I could try. There's a storm coming to South Carolina. It has a very sort of like choppy intonation. Yeah, and I'm not great. I'm not great at sounding like I'm from different places. I can do like very isolated words. So like in the South, we'd say like hot dog. In California, they'd say like hot dog. They wouldn't have that aw in dog. That's my party trick. And I imagine most of you from not the South and not the sort of East Coast couldn't hear the difference. So yeah, we're getting a little bit off track, but I will answer this last question. Any funny words or accent things from your area? Yes. So the most distinctive feature that I have is the name for a drive-through liquor store. Yes, they're a thing. Are they a bad idea? So the law in Virginia is you can't have an open liquor container in your car, but you can have a sealed one, like one that's like manufacturer sealed. So you get like a sealed thing when you go through the drive-through liquor store. And our name for that is brew-through, and that is very centralized to sort of the Tidewater region of Virginia and sort of like out into Piedmont. I don't think people would say it in DC, but that's my most distinctive linguistic features that I'd call that a brew-through. Yeah. And I wouldn't, I would also say that nobody's accent is inherently funny or mockable. Every language variety is deserving of, respect and appreciation. All right, so I'm gonna wrap it up. We got a little bit off track, but you know me, I'm always happy to talk about language stuff. If you are interested, nope. It's on my coffee, code YouTube for 20% off, and also there's a link in the description below. I hope you find it helpful. I've been working with language technology for either over or under a decade, depending on how strict you want to be with started working with. I'm gonna say just under. And I've seen a lot of people make the same mistakes over and over again, and I don't want you to. I want you to avoid it. And if it's too late for you, then I don't know, maybe grab a copy and give it to some junior engineers and be like, don't do what I did. So yeah. So I'm gonna wrap it up there. Thanks so much for joining me. We'll be back on Thursday for our usual coffee chat, so covering news from the last week. A lot of legal position papers this week. And before we head out, I do want to say thank you to my wonderful monthly coffee supporters. Yes, this side, I did it right. Thank you, I appreciate you. You help make this channel possible, and you're great. Thank you. So I will see you on Thursday. Have a great week. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.